Please welcome Stephen Olson, y'all.
So a couple of months ago, I told a story about how I managed to help a family that was stuck in a sandy trench and get their van out of the trench. And I said, if you learn anything from the story, the one thing I wanted you to learn was that I was right and my wife was wrong. But after I did the story and I sat down and I thought about it and I started to think, there's more to that story than my wife being wrong. But I'm not going to tell that story again. I'm just going to tell a different story that kind of has the same example of the point that I want to get across. A new restaurant opened up in Norwalk, and my wife and I decided we would have our lunch there. And we got in, sat down, just a table for two people. In front of us was a row of family tables, enough for four people. There was a family sitting in front of us, a couple young kids, mother and father. And after we ordered, that family got up and left. And when our food came, a young man came in, and he asked for that table. So he was directly in front of me. My wife's back was to him, so she really didn't see him that well. At one point, after he made his order, he got up and I think maybe went to the bathroom, I'm not sure. But the waitress came back with his milkshake and was kind of wondering what had happened to him. And as she was asking around, he came back and sat down. And then she brought him his macaroni and cheese. So he ordered a vanilla milkshake and macaroni and cheese. He was taking photographs of his meal. It wasn't that easy because on one of his hands he had a cast. So my wife and I basically finished our meal, and again, her back was to him. She wasn't seeing any of this. He got up, left, and went outside. And I thought, he hasn't paid yet. And the waitress came back and started looking for him and noticed that he was outside. So she went out and talked to him, and he said, "Oh, I just stepped out for a smoke." And she said, "That's fine, but you have to pay your bill first." So she brought him back in. He sat down at the same booth, handed her a credit card. She took the credit card up to the cashier. Apparently, there was something wrong with the credit card. So she comes back to the man, tells him that the credit card didn't go through. He acted surprised. The manager comes. They go up to the cashier. He's on the phone with someone, I'm not sure who, maybe the credit card company. Waitress comes back to give us our bill, and I said, is he having some issues there? And she says, yeah, he is. We're not sure if he's going to be able to pay his bill. So I said, I'll pay it. And the waitress said I didn't have to do that. And my wife said, you definitely shouldn't do that. And I went ahead and said, no, I'm going to pay it. And my wife stormed out of the restaurant. So they settled his bill. On his way out, he looked at me, nodded, and said thank you, and left. Well, I can tell you right now, the ride home wasn't very pleasant. Because my wife was so concerned about our financial issues, and she's saying, and you didn't do anything. You didn't help this person. You basically enabled him. You know, he just comes into a restaurant and hopes that someone is going to pay his bill. And I said, do you remember you're Jewish? I said, aren't you supposed to do a mitzvah, which is basically a good deed? There's also an ideal in the Jewish culture that 10% of your income should go to charity. And I said, there's an ideal in Jewish culture that we are placed on this earth to repair it, to create paradise here. So when we got home, she calls up my son and daughter. My daughter thought I was crazy. My son was concerned that maybe I was getting Alzheimer's. And I can understand them thinking this because when they were growing up, we had very little money. At times I was working 3 jobs. At one point I was on unemployment for a year, and we had to scrape by. And I was criticized for being cheap, but I had to keep reminding them, I'm not cheap, I'm poor. And the thing that I didn't get to tell my wife or my children was this, that my wife's back was to the man. I was sitting watching him. We had decided to come to that restaurant on that day at that time. We could have come before that family left, but we didn't. We came when that young man came into the restaurant. And for me, it was like a story unfolding in front of me. And I had to choose to be part of that story or ignore it. And to me, I couldn't ignore it. And mac and cheese and a milkshake. The restaurant was kind of expensive. This bill came to $20. I just didn't think that was that big of a deal. And here was a young man with a cast on, obviously struggling. And, you know, I don't know anything about him. He could have been a drug addict. I don't know. He could have been the kind of person who just doesn't take care of himself or do anything that should be out of motivation. But that didn't matter because this story was being presented to me. And I felt that I needed to be a part of it. I think the ideal is that life begins when you interact with reality. And we have a choice. Things are presented to us, and we can either choose to ignore them, or we could choose to participate and make the world better. And that was my choice. Now, I've been very lucky in my lifetime. I've saved 3 people from drowning. I've fed an immigrant from Nigeria. He was panhandling in front of a Chinese restaurant. We were going into a pizza place. I sat down and I thought about him, and I said, you know, we can get him a slice of pizza. So I went out and offered him a slice of pizza, and he said that he couldn't eat pizza, but he would appreciate some spring rolls. So I bought him some spring rolls. And when we came out of the restaurant, he was very polite and very thankful, you know, that had been passed on to him. And we may not have paradise now, but it just seems to me it's really up to us to create that in this world. Thank you.
Stephen Olson.